All right. Good evening, everybody. So I want to welcome you all here to the President's Lecture Series. My name is Seth Bodner. I'm the president of the University of Montana, and we are so honored to have you here with us to hear from one of Montana's own, Ambassador Michael McFaul. We are very honored to have him here, not just at the University of Montana, but here in our Missoula community. Before we get started, I want to welcome and again thank you for being here at this year's final installation of the President's Lecture Series. You know, the President's Lecture Series has been a fixture at the University of Montana for more than 3 decades. It epitomizes what's best about a university: the exchange of ideas, the discussion of topics of interest, bringing in thinkers to challenge our perceptions, to make us aware of events outside of our normal spheres of knowledge and interest. And tonight is no exception. You know, this year we've made some changes to the President's Lecture Series. For the first time ever, we have had the President's Lecture Series off of our campus. We have had it now for the 3rd time here in the Wilma, a Missoula icon. And I want to thank Logjam Presents. I want to thank Nick Chakota and his team for making this possible. Because we are one community, we are one university, we are one city, and we are better when we're together. Tonight we will have to run our Q&A, our City Council President and our very own, our favorite rocket scientist, Brian Van Lossberg, will run our Q&A. And I'm so grateful for the partnership of this community and the important role that this community of Missoula plays in making the University of Montana the university that it is. You know, the President's Lecture Series does not happen without a lot of work. And 3 people in particular I want to thank for the work that they've done this year, and that's Rob Saudine, Elizabeth Dubb, and Dina Mansour. They made these lectures happen. They brought these speakers in. They worked through the logistics. They made it happen here at the Wilma and did a real service not just for the university, but for this community. And I want to ask you to give them a round of applause this evening. And without further ado, I would like to bring on our very own Dina Mansour, the director of the Mansfield Center, to introduce Ambassador McFaul.
Well, thank you very much. It's my great honor to be here and represent Rob, Elizabeth, and the members of the President's Lecture Committee. Thank you for joining us this evening for the Lucille Spear Memorial Lecture. It's an annual lecture that we have as part of the President's Lecture Series. And just to reinforce President Bodner's comments, I want to thank the audience for being here and really personifying what this lecture is all about in terms of community and creating opportunities for us to engage in discussions around a diverse range of ideas that animate our lives. The Lucille Spear Lecture represents what is so special about this community. This is a memorial lecture that honors a woman's lifelong passion in the areas of civics and public affairs. And in fact, these are the hallmark strengths of the University of Montana and Missoula. We gather here in the Wilma in a tradition of civic discourse, and in this spirit, I'd like to call our attention to the valley within which the Wilma sits. The University of Montana acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people, and today we honor the path that they have always shown us in caring for this place for generations to come. So I'd also like to share with you more about the namesake of tonight's lecture. Lucille Spear earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Montana and then completed graduate school at the University of Chicago. She returned to Montana to teach at Kalispell High School before she began in 1928 a 40-year career in UM's library in the Documents Division. She and her family were deeply involved in education in Montana, and Spear herself was actively and passionately involved in her community and state. She was a member of the League of Women Voters and the Missoula Democratic Club, and she worked on Eugene McCarthy's campaign in 1968. At 73, she was the oldest delegate to the Montana Constitutional Convention. And I'd like to recognize that she has a number of family members here tonight, including her grandniece Joni Hayes and her husband Mike, who will be celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary this Friday. Yeah, congratulations. So in Lucille Spear's honor, we welcome Ambassador McFaul, who stewarded relations with Russia as America's former top diplomat in Moscow. So on behalf of President Bodnar and my colleagues at the President's Lecture Series, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Mike McFaul and tell you a little bit about him. I have to tell you, I've spent the day with him, and he has just been an incredible mix of everything that we want representing the President's Lecture Series. He's a Montana boy. He was born in Glasgow, grew up in Butte, went to junior high and high school in Bozeman. Yeah, I figured that Butte would definitely get a few cheers. He has been enriching lives of students at Hellgate High School, involved in our academic community, reaching out to thousands of people through media interviews, and he has really worked tirelessly to represent his passion of mutual understanding and people-to-people engagement. He is a professor of political science at Stanford University, also an analyst for NBC News, and a contributing columnist to the Washington Post. He served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russian and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council, and then as U.S. Ambassador to the Russian Federation from 2012 to 2014. He has authored several books, most recently the New York Times bestseller From Cold War to Hot Peace, An American Ambassador in Putin's Russia. And I would really encourage you to purchase one of those books. We have fact and fiction in the lobby, and he will be signing books afterwards. It's really a fascinating book, and we'll flesh out the content of his talk tonight. He, again, was born and raised in Montana. He received his BA in International Relations and Slavic Studies and his MA in Soviet and East European Studies from Stanford University. As a Rhodes Scholar, like our president, he completed his doctorate in Philosophy and International Relations at Oxford University. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador McFaul.
Thank you. Thank you, Dina. Wow! Oh my God! Thank you. Thank you. Are those really people sitting up there? Wow. Excellent. Excellent. I can't see you, but I can hear you. Thanks for coming. What a wonderful crowd and a wonderful place. I'm really honored to be here. Thanks for those introductions. I do feel a little bit like I'm in enemy territory here. I am a Bobcat after all. At least I have more Bobcat T-shirts than I do Grizzlies, so maybe we can change that over the course of the night and tomorrow. But seriously, it's an honor to be back home. Montana is one of the most awesome places in the world. I've lived abroad many... Yes, we can applaud that. I've lived all over the world. I've been to 80 countries, but there's no place in the world like Montana. This is a nicer part than Glasgow, Montana, by the way, this part of the state. But it's great to be back. And it's great to be back to talk about my book. That's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to try to tease you to think about, well, maybe you should buy it. You don't have to read it. You just have to buy it. And it's a story partly about my life, but partly about U.S.-Russian relations. And so I want to tell my story, and then we're going to talk about, we can have questions, and we can talk about anything you want after that. I want to take you back, and I can see some gray hair out there, but I can also see some students, which is really great. And so for the people with gray hair, you know what the Cold War was. When I lecture at Stanford, I have to explain what it was. And I just want to remind you, before I get to the heart of my story, which takes place after the Cold War, that it was a really scary time. Remember that. When anybody says, oh, I'm nostalgic for the old days of stability, I want to remind you how scary it was. In fact, as a high school kid at Bozeman Senior High, I originally got interested in Russia because of I joined the debate team, by the way. We ran a case about expanding U.S. trade to the Soviet Union. My debate partner, by the way, you might know this guy. His name's Steve Daines. Leave your politics aside. He's a good guy. And we are a pretty good debate team, by the way. I think we beat Missoula that year. Anyway, that was when I got interested, but it wasn't just because of debate. It was because I, as a 17-year-old kid, after I left Bozeman to attend Stanford, I was scared to death that we were going to blow up the planet. Ronald Reagan had just been elected president when I arrived at Stanford, and I had this idea that, man, these politicians, they're screwing up the world. And if we, people, society to society, could just get to know each other better, Soviets and Americans, we could reduce tensions between our two societies. And that was kind of my theory of diplomacy, right? That's kind of my idea. So as a freshman kid at Stanford, I registered for first-year Russian and Poli-Sci 35, how nations deal with each other. And then 2 years later, I decided I have to go test this theory, this hypothesis. I have to go to the Soviet Union and see if, you know, in my own personal experience, if they're really as different as everybody says they are. I'd never been abroad, by the way. It was my first trip abroad. Most Stanford kids go to Florence or London or Paris. I went to Leningrad, Soviet Union. Back then, to remind you, for those of you who are too young, our president back then called the Soviet Union the evil empire. Remember that. And so imagine that phone call to my mom in Bozeman, who, by the way, thought California was a communist country back then. A bunch of hippies, you know, with their big Winnebagos crowding up our roads. And then I came back with longish hair. If I can point. There we go. There I am at the Bozeman International Airport. I think we flew to Calgary back then. That's why we called it international. On my way from Bozeman, Montana to the USSR. By the way, bless my mother's heart, she's been supportive of mine ever since. But back then, it was kind of kooky to go to the Soviet Union. And over time, it turned out that I didn't think these people were so different than us. I met people my age. They liked Led Zeppelin. I liked Led Zeppelin. Basic kind of things that college kids are interested, they were. And it gradually became an optimistic time that maybe Russians and Americans were moving closer together. These two guys had a lot to do with it. That's Ronald Reagan on the right, Mikhail Gorbachev on the left. That's in 1988. And back then, we were moving in this cooperative space. By the way, these 300,000 people had a lot to do with it. These are all people demonstrating for democracy, markets, and a closer relationship with the West. If you look really hard, there I am. I'm there. By the way, Vladimir Putin knows that. We're going to come back to that in a minute. Remember this slide. But after this really scary time, there was this incredibly optimistic time. Look at all those people there wanting to be closer to us. And the end of the Cold War, for me, was one of the most euphoric events of my life. This was a time when we were cooperating with the Russians. That's Boris Yeltsin speaking before a joint session of Congress. And this is a cooperative time, right? That's a little bit too much cooperation there, isn't it? Those guys like to have a good time. They both had big appetites and not just about food, especially the guy on the left. All right, let's now fast forward to our moment. Our moment has none of that euphoric feel, right? If you believe Dmitry Medvedev, he's the Prime Minister of Russia right now, he said in 2016 that this current era that we're in feels like 1962. That's the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Our president, of course, on Twitter, there you go, there he is. He thinks it's actually worse than the Cold War. And, you know, maybe I'll leave this for questions to go into this in detail. In fact, I will leave it for questions. Maybe just highlight a few things. we can do a kind of compare and contrast. Are we better off today in something I call the hot peace or the Cold War? Makes a great exam question, by the way, to compare and contrast. Let me just highlight a few just to show you how complex it is. So, some good news. The good news is that we are not in a quantitative nuclear arms race with Russia today. We're moving in the right direction. From a peak of 40 or 50,000, we're now down to 1,550 nuclear weapons that they can have and we can have. By the way, you can still blow up the planet with 1,500 weapons. We got a lot of work to do, but we're going in the right direction. The bad news is that we are now in a qualitative nuclear arms race with the Russians that in many ways feels more destabilizing to me than that Cold War era. And it's on the offensive and defensive side. Putin has announced recently some new weapons that are not controlled by arms control treaties, and we don't have any defenses against them. Good or bad, better or worse, you tell me. One more, maybe two more. Good news. The good news is that the ideological struggle between communism and capitalism, or communism and freedom, is over. That part of the Cold War is over. They're still fighting about it over in Berkeley, by the way, and maybe here in Missoula, I don't know. But most of the world, we moved on from that debate. It's not important anymore. It's fundamental to the Cold War, it's over. The bad news is that Putin himself, Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, actually thinks that he is fighting a new ideological struggle, but it's a different kind of one. He thinks of himself as the leader of the conservative Christian world, and that he is in battle with the decadent liberal West, the multilateral West that doesn't appreciate sovereignty, but it's really about these values things. By the way, he's been fighting this ideological battle abroad for a long time. He's invested a lot of money into it with NGOs and with political leaders and things like Russia Today and Sputnik, if you've seen their social media outlets and television stations. But lately, he's been having some success. He now has allies in leadership in places like Hungary and Italy. Nationalist parties throughout Europe are more sympathetic to Putin than they are to the United States. And even here in our own country, on the alt-right side, and some would even say some of the advisors to President Trump, espouse this set of ideological views. And notice, this is a fight not between states ideologically, but within states. Better or worse, you tell me. Last one. The means are different. The good news is that we are not fighting proxy wars all over the globe to fight the Soviets like we did during the Cold War. The Cold War actually wasn't cold at all. Millions of people died, including many, many Americans. Always remember that. It was not cold. And in wars far away, from Vietnam to Korea to Angola, we were engaged. We thought we had to fight the Soviets all over the planet. Thankfully, that era is over. The means of fighting with the Russians has changed. But there's some new things that are pretty troubling in terms of the way we're fighting during the hot peace. Annexation. We thought we got rid of annexation after World War II. In many ways, we fought World War II to prevent annexation in the future in Europe, and yet it's back. Putin annexed Crimea in 2014. Sanctions. Today, there are more Russians on the U.S. sanctions list than at any time in U.S. Soviet or U.S. Russian history. In fact, if you added up all the people from the beginning of our relationship, going back 200 years, there's more on that list today than in the previous 200 years. And by the way, there are also more Americans on the Russian sanctions list than any time in the history of U.S.-Russian relations. I know, because I'm on that sanctions list. I can't travel to Russia because of this means that we're fighting. And then last, some of the means that Putin has adopted lately are qualitatively different. And let me just emphasize one, the 2016 presidential elections here in our country. Yes, the Soviets engaged in propaganda to try to influence the way people thought about their societies in Europe and marginally in the United States. But never have we seen this kind of intervention in what should be one of the most sovereign things that we do as a nation, to choose our leader. That's new, that's different, qualitatively different than anything we had during the Cold War. So, you know, we can argue about it, and let's talk about it in questions, better or worse. It's somewhere in the middle. I think most people would agree that we're most certainly not where we were at the end of the Cold War in that cooperative period, right? So what I want to do for the next, oh, good, I got a lot of time. What I want to do in the next 15 or 20 minutes is just explain that. You know, what happened? If you don't remember any other slide, just remember this slide from my talk, okay? What happened between that period and those two guys and that meeting on the right? By the way, I was at that meeting on the right. That's in Los Cabos, Mexico. That's Putin on the right and my former boss, Barack Obama, on the left. And the meeting was a lot worse than that photo, okay? So what I want to do, you know, sounding somewhat like a professor, somewhat like a former ambassador, I just want to walk you through some possible explanations as to explain those two photos. That's what I'm going to do for the next 15 or 20 minutes. And there are going to be three big explanations that I want to focus on, these three. Let's start with the first one, because it's first. Structure of the international system. This is an argument about power. Oh, I hope I didn't skip too far. Oh, you caught me. Thank you, sir. Just run that slide if you can. Excellent. Thank you. I can tell I'm sometimes hitting the computer, I'm sometimes not. We're in a cooperative relationship in the background. Thank you. You're doing a great job for helping me. That's because I'm wandering around, and he asked me not to wander around, so it's my fault, not his. So what do you see here? This is a map of 1,000 years of European history. We're not going to go through it all. But what do you see? You see some states and some empires, some entities rising in power, gaining power. Some of their neighbors are collapsing in power. They're becoming weaker relative to their neighbors. And what happens as a result of that is you get the changes of the borders that you're watching, right? You get annexation. And so from this perspective, by the way, it takes 400 more years before Crimea becomes part of Russia. It's still about to be gobbled up by the Ottomans. Well, let's come back to Crimea later in questions. But the argument here is that what we're seeing today with Russia and the United States, it's not good or bad. It's just the way it is. Power is the driver of the international system. Russia was weak after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1999. Russia is back today, way more powerful today than it was 30 years ago. And they're just acting like your typical, normal, great power, annexing territory, just like they've always done, as I just showed you for hundreds. And if you go all the way back to Thucydides, you would say thousands of years of history. And I want to be clear, part of this explanation is most certainly valid. Power matters in the international system. I'm not making a claim that it doesn't. Let's take an absurd couple of examples. Anybody here from Moldova? That's usually a safe one. I don't see any hands up. Okay, good. I'm going to talk about Moldova for 30 seconds then. And then, let me be clear, I love Moldova. I've been to Moldova. It's a great place. I went there with the vice president once, Vice President Biden. He had 50,000 people come to listen to him speak. They loved us too. But you're not interested in a talk about U.S.-Moldovan relations. And that's because Moldova doesn't have the power to annex territory of its neighbors, or to prop up dictators in the Middle East, or to intervene in our elections, right? So capabilities matters. It's part of the story, just to take an extreme instance where a weaker power. But I have a couple of problems with just a focus on power, and let me just explain a couple of them. One, I can think of some states that rise in power that don't threaten the international system, that don't annex territory, and that don't threaten the United States. Germany and Japan are obvious ones. I'm not worried about them threatening the United States. Even countries like Poland, right? Poland's way more powerful today than 30 years ago, and I don't lose a lot of sleep over going to war with Poland. I don't. And if we have time in questions, I even want to talk about China. I don't think it's inevitable that we are going to have a war with China as China rises. But so I can think of some anomalies, right? But the second one is the one I want to focus on, and it has to do with why the pivot in this more antagonistic way, especially when Putin went into Ukraine in 2014. Why 2014? Why not 2004? Why not earlier? Russia obviously had that power before. Why did it take place when it did? That, I think, demands an explanation. In fact, it's even more complicated than that, because when I showed up as the U.S. ambassador in 2012, Putin's #1 foreign policy priority was to get Ukraine to join something called the Eurasia Economic Union. This was his response to the European Union, right? They had their union. He wanted to bring together all the states that had emerged independent from the collapse of the Soviet Union and make Russia at the center of it and have the Eurasia Economic Union, them all trading together. By the time when I showed up, he had Belarus and Kazakhstan had already joined, and his focus, and I would say it was #1 foreign policy objective back in 2012 and 13, was to get Ukraine to join. We wrote tons of cables about this. Nobody read them in Washington. Nobody cared. But without question, this was his focus. And you might say, well, why? And this, I promise, I'm a professor, so I'm used to like asking questions. I won't single anybody out, I promise. I'm not a law professor. But listen to the question closely, and this will explain why Ukraine was so important. So, who here has bought something made in Russia, сделано в России, for those Russian speakers, but you bought it here in the United States of America? And tell me what you bought. What did you buy, sir or madam? I can't see you. You bought a stuffed animal? And it was made in Russia? Where did you buy that? Okay, all right. It's a little, okay, I got it. So, all right, that's interesting. I've been giving this book talk a lot. Nobody's ever said that. Missoula's a little different. I've heard you guys are a little funky up here. All right, Chubarashka. All right, anybody else? Made in Russia. What else did you buy? Anybody else? Telescope. Okay, that comes up from time to time. Not many Americans buy Russian telescopes, but those that are fanatics know that they do that. Anybody else? Vodka, all right, vodka. Russians make vodka that they export. I would highly recommend Polish vodka over the Russian vodka. I'm a vodka connoisseur, but go ahead and keep buying that cheap Russian vodka. Anybody else? Yeah, what did you buy, sir?
Well, I didn't buy it, but I know you could buy ammunition, rounds.
Only in Montana would that come up. Actually, that's not true. I was in Ohio a couple weeks ago, and somebody said the same thing. So, yes, you can do that. But all right, let's stop this game before it gets into more extreme things. I've encountered a few people who bought some Russian guns, AK-47s. I'm not sure they were telling the truth, but they raised their hand to say that. All right, the point is, all right, these are some exotic things people have purchased. That's interesting. Most of you didn't raise your hands, just so if you can't see the audience, because most Americans, unlike some of the people here in Missoula, don't buy goods made in Russia, right? Because they don't make things that we want to buy. They don't make televisions. They don't make suits. They don't make cars that Americans, or for that matter, most Europeans want to buy. That's just, look at the trade statistics, that's true. Oil and gas, yes, caviar, things that come out of the ground, or fish, we'll buy from Russia. But most things made by them, very few people in the West buy things made in Russia. But in 2012, there were 45 million people that used to buy a lot of goods made in Russia. It's called Ukraine. And that's why it was so imperative for Putin to get them to join. Because if Ukraine would join this Eurasian Economic Union, that would make this whole thing hum and be good for Russian traders and investors. And yet, after that focus and the negotiations on it, which were very intense, in 2014, Putin invades Ukraine, I think guaranteeing forever that they're never going to join his silly Eurasian Economic Union, right? People don't like to be invaded and then say, join my club. So that suggests to me, as a social scientist, is there's got to be more to this story than just power. There's got to be something more proximate that happened that compelled Putin to pivot off what was his #1 foreign policy objective, and we're going to get to that in a minute. All right, there's another explanation, It's all our fault. We did this. We Americans, we the United States, and I shouldn't say that. I don't want to presume that everybody in this audience is from the United States, but our fault. We made this the confrontational relationship that it is. And here's the basic story. This is the story that Putin would tell you if you sat down with him to talk about the explanation for this. So when they were weak, we went over there and we lectured them about democracy and markets, our imperial ideas, and then we expanded NATO, then we bombed Serbia in 1999, we invaded Iraq, we supported color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, and finally Putin just said, enough is enough. I'm tired of these American imperialists. It is time for somebody to stand up to them, and that's going to be Russia. Okay? That's the explanation. And I want to be clear, all of these events happened. I write about every single one of them in my book. And all of these events increased tension in U.S.-Russian relations when they happened. That is all true. The Russians did some things that increased tensions too, but let's leave them out for the purposes of tonight. And yet, after all of that drama, there was a period of cooperation. At the time when I joined the government in 2009. When we sat down with the president, and first president-elect and then the president, we did a review of our policy, an interagency review, and we came up with a different approach to Russia. You can read the slide there, but it was pretty simple. It was just, we're not going to cooperate with them on everything, but in some areas, we believe, we had a theory, we had an idea, an intuition, that there are some areas where their interests overlap with ours, and through diplomacy, we can realize what President Obama liked to call win-win outcomes through this diplomacy, right? And we called it the reset. By the way, that is his Tuesday, Monday, his 6th day in office. He looks pretty good there, doesn't he? Actually, he still looks really good. I gave him a copy of my book a couple months ago. He's working out. He's feeling good about life. And it's my 5th day at the job, by the way. This is a transition period, right? We still had a lot of Bush folks working for us. As I walked out, one of them grabbed me by the arm and said, Mr. McFaul, you're not supposed to touch the desk. I don't know if that's true, but if you're ever in briefing the president, don't touch the desk, okay? I'll go through this quickly, but I just want to remind you that there was a period for about 3 or 4 years in the first term of the Obama administration and the time when President Medvedev was the president of Russia, that's the guy on the right, when we were cooperating and we were getting things done. Not ancient history, this is just a few years ago. This was a great day in my life. We're in Prague, the spring of 2010, and they're signing that big thing on the left there is the New START Treaty, reducing by 30% the number of nuclear weapons in the world. That's a pretty good outcome. That's a cooperative thing, right? And let me just say, as a footnote to that, I was in the government for 5 years. It's hard to do anything in the government. Most days you just get up, you have a bunch of problems, you go home, you come back, you still have the same problems, and then weeks go by, and months go by, and years go by, and you've done nothing, right? That's a usual career in the U.S. government. I, at the National Security Council at the White House, sat across the hallway from the 2 gentlemen that were in charge of the Middle East peace process. Imagine what their years felt like, right? So I just want to emphasize that, this was a big achievement. This was a real outcome that I think was good for America, and I presume it was good for Russia, or they wouldn't sign it. And oh, by the way, we also got it ratified through the U.S. Senate. That's a pretty hard thing to do these days. We got 72 votes, and this is us celebrating that day. Only day I drank in the Oval Office, by the way. That is not a common occurrence. And let me just run through a couple others, just to remind you that there was a period in U.S.-Russian relations where we cooperated. So there's this thing called NDN. When we arrived at the White House, we did a policy review of our war efforts in Afghanistan, and we changed the policy. We decided that we were going to go after terrorists, not just in Afghanistan, but we were going to go after them in Pakistan from time to time. We were going to violate their sovereignty and go and get them where we could find them. There was just one big problem with that strategy. at the time, in 2009, 95, maybe 98%, depending on how you count, of our supplies to our soldiers in Afghanistan went through Pakistan, through the southern route, as we call it. So we were dependent on Pakistan. We couldn't do this new idea that we had with respect to fighting terrorism. So it was my job at the White House to develop this thing called NDN, which was a northern route. We're going to try that one again? Okay. Thank you. A northern route through Russia, using our airplanes and trains and trucks and automobiles and through Central Asia to reduce our dependence on Pakistan. And by the time I left the White House, 50% of our supplies went through Russia and Central Asia. And there are some historians here, so correct me in the questions if I'm wrong, but I believe during this period was the first time since World War II that American soldiers were flying through Russian airspace to fight a common enemy in Afghanistan and eventually in Pakistan. Because there was one day, I was still working at the White House, in 2011, where we decided to go after a very famous terrorist, Osama bin Laden, in Pakistan, and we did. And we killed Osama bin Laden that day. It was a great day to be at the National Security Council. Some people have been working on that problem literally since 2001. We could not have done that without NDN. Russians were helping us on a very concrete security objective. Third, Iran. I'll go quicker through some of these more quickly. We put in place the most comprehensive multilateral sanctions against Iran. I think they have to be multilateral to work. And those sanctions created the predicate for the Iran nuclear deal that we later negotiated with the Iranians, with the Russians at the table by our side when we negotiated that deal. And I think that's a good deal for America. I think President Trump made a big mistake in pulling out of that. And then fourth, because we have time, let me just mention something that doesn't get a lot of attention usually in history books, the non-events. Nobody writes an event, nobody writes about books about non-events, right? But when I was in the government, these were really striking to me. These were things that almost happened, and then they didn't because we diffused them. And for me, without question, most of you, I'm sure, have never heard about it because it didn't get written about, right? It was a non-event. But there was, for me, this was one of the scariest things I dealt with at the White House. There was a revolution in Kyrgyzstan. The government was overthrown. 100 people died. 300,000 people, ethnic Uzbeks living in Kyrgyzstan, fled the country because it felt like there was going to be this genocidal civil war there, and we were worried that it might spill into an interstate war. And you may say, well, why do I care about Kyrgyzstan? Well, at the time, our most important air base for fighting the war in Afghanistan was in Kyrgyzstan, Manaz Air Base. That's why we cared. But you didn't read about genocidal war. You didn't read about the color revolution in Kyrgyzstan that produced a confrontation in U.S.-Russian relations, because back then, with Medvedev as president, by the way, important detail, we got together, we got on the phone with him, and we decided, hey, it's not in your interest to have this thing blow up. It's not in our interest. Let's work together to defuse this crisis. And we did. This slide represents thousands, maybe tens of thousands of hours of my life. I'm sure it looks pretty boring to you. And so I'm not going to go into the details about it, but I want to just remind you that the economic story during this period was also moving in the right direction. Trade was up by 40%, investment was up by 40%, and by the way, Russians were even investing here in Montana during this period. It was an economic time that was moving in the positive direction. And then among society, at the peak of the reset, most Russians had a positive view of us, of you, and most Americans had a positive view of Russia, over 60% in both countries. And that's not 30 years ago, that's not 100 years ago, that's 5 or 6 years ago. So, for me, you can't blame these events that caused tension in the past and not account for the cooperative period that I just talked about and say that they're responsible for our current level of confrontation, right? That just doesn't make logical sense. Well, you can do it. You can do it in my class. You'll get a C- if I'm feeling good. It's just a bad causal argument, right? We had cooperation after all this stuff. Something else must have be added to the equation to account for our current confrontation now. And that's the last thing I want to talk about, the last argument, which is really about Russian domestic politics, not about the structure of the system or American foreign policy. And let me just focus on two, and I'll be quick, two events in particular that are most important. One, the transition from Medvedev to Putin, and two, at almost the same time, massive demonstrations against the Russian regime. The combination of those two things, I think, are what drove us into this confrontational period we're in now. Let me explain that and then take your questions. All right, first, Medvedev to Putin. At a party congress in September 2011, Putin very loudly, if you can see him there screaming, announces that he's going to run for a new term as president, and Medvedev, to the right, is then going to serve as prime minister. That's September 2011. And I'm still working at the White House at this time, and I remember it well. In fact, I was in to see the president, I think it was actually about, it was about the Middle East. It was about the Arab Spring with a group of people. And at the end of it, just a couple days after this announcement, he grabs my arm, pulls me back into the Oval Office, and he says, well, hey, Mike, you know, what do you think? What does this mean? And at the time, the assessment in our government, including the intelligence community, not just the National Security Council, was that Putin was the big dog. He was the prime minister. Medvedev was just the marionette. And so switching jobs shouldn't change the policy, right? You know, no, what's going to change here? Putin's just going to move down the street, move into the Kremlin from the White House. That's where the government sits, and there shouldn't be any change. And so I told the president that. I said, well, that's our assessment. You know, there's this kind of language you talk about when you're talking about intelligence. Our assessment is, you know, with high confidence, we believe, blah, blah, blah. And he turned to me. He likes this phrase. And he looked at me and he said, come on, man. You don't believe that. And I said, no, Mr. President, I actually don't believe that. I had known Putin and followed him and written about him for a long time. I'd met him first in the spring of 1991. We're not exactly Facebook friends, but although given what goes on Facebook, who knows, right? That Natasha who's always trolling me, that's actually Vladimir Putin. Anyway, I said, no, you know, this is going to be difficult. We're going to have to try to work with him to see win-win outcomes, but there's a difference between Putin and Medvedev. And over the next couple of years, you know, interacting with Putin, after almost 4 years with Medvedev, we saw those differences. Leaders do matter. They have different worldviews. Putin is not a win-win guy, right? I told you about the New START Treaty, win-win. He doesn't believe in win-win. He believes in zero-sum. If it's +2 for America, it is -2 for Russia in his worldview. Second, remember, Medvedev was a younger guy, a lawyer from an intelligentsia family. Putin's from the KGB. He didn't go to Stanford to learn about how nations deal with each other. He went to the KGB school, and back then, during the Cold War, we, of course, were the enemy. And people that joined the KGB back then were especially motivated to go fight the enemy and defend the homeland. For him, the Soviet Union back then. But this third point is the most important one. Putin has a theory about American foreign policy. He believes that we use overt and covert power to overthrow regimes that we don't like. And guess what? Yeah, there's a lot of empirical data to support that hypothesis. You know, over time, over the last 70, some would say, you know, going back 170 years, that has happened in American history, right? And in fact, we sat down and we debated this with Putin one day in July 2009, out at his house. It was a very nice breakfast he served. We had 3 different kinds of caviar. I think 2 were illegal, by the way, for Americans. And I just can't help myself, just because President Trump has had a summit recently with Putin, when he decided to go alone and to not have a note-taker. That was in Helsinki. Notice we have advisors there. We have General Jones, the National Security Advisor, former Ambassador Bill Burns from Moscow, and I'm there. Oh, and notice we also have a note-taker. That's me. A good idea when you're meeting with Putin. Because Putin's not there just to have happy talk and eat caviar. He's got an agenda. And for this meeting, he was loaded for bear. He was like all worked up about the Bush administration and all the horrific mistakes they had made. Never George W. Bush, by the way. He's got a soft spot for the president. He likes George W. Bush a lot more than he does President Obama. But it was the deep state, right? Cheney, CIA, Pentagon. They had done all these nasty things in the world. And he walked through them for like 58 minutes. He was prepared. And then he got to Iraq. And he said, you Americans, you screwed everything up in the Middle East. Why did you do that? What a silly war that you did, tragic war. You've messed everything up. And my boss, the President of the United States, in response to that, he said, you're right. I agree with you. And Putin was kind of like, hold on, I'm playing the Russian side here. You're the American side. He'd never heard an American say that, right? He'd been dealing with President Bush since 2003. And Obama said, well, long before it was popular, I was against that war. And it's part of the reason why I was elected President of the United States. And, Putin looked at him and said, well, that's interesting. It's different. By the time we walked out to the cars, I'm listening to the chit-chat. And, I got the sense that Putin thought, well, okay, maybe this guy is different. Maybe he is going to move us in a slightly different direction in terms of this theory he had about American foreign policy. But fast forward to 2011, just a year and a half later, and the Arab Spring, what happened, you had mass mobilization against regimes throughout the region. And I want to be clear about this, and I write about this in my book. We had nothing to do with starting this revolution in Egypt or Tunisia or Syria or Libya. We were reacting to the events that these people started. It wasn't us. But we had to react to them, right? We felt we had to react to them. And in particular, this event was a pivotal one in U.S.-Russian relations. If you may remember, maybe you've forgotten, but the demonstrations broke out, then a war broke out, and Gaddafi vowed to just slaughter those that were protesting against him, and he was marching towards the city of Benghazi. And it was our assessment, again, back to the intelligence assessment, that he was serious about that threat, that he was going to wipe out the entire city of Benghazi, what was kind of the opposition base. And we decided we're not just going to stand by and watch that happen, with one caveat. President Obama believes in multilateral institutions. He believes in the international order. He believes in the UN Security Council. And therefore, a predicate to doing this was we had to get the Russians to agree to authorize the use of force with us. And I was actually there the night we first found out that they were going to do that. It was in the Kremlin. Vice President Biden was meeting with President Medvedev that night. And the night he met with them, Medvedev said, you guys are right. Your analysis is right. We can't sit by. Russia, I am going to abstain on the Security Council resolution, 1973, that authorized the use of force in Libya. And in many ways, that was the peak of cooperation with Russia. Because Russia, before or since Soviet Union, most certainly never authorized the use of force inside a country, right? They had never done that, and here it was, Medvedev did that. And we thought, man, maybe the world order is changing. We can cooperate with Russia in this way. 2 days later, however, Putin weighed in as the prime minister and publicly chastised Medvedev for abstaining on that vote. He said he made a mistake. He actually used this really over-the-top language. He said, you're allowing the crusaders to come back to the Middle East. That's us. I think that's when he decided, Medvedev's drinking too much of this reset Kool-Aid. He's gotten too close to Obama. It's time for me to come back. But in Putin's mind, all of these events, and this event especially, that was us again. That was the CIA, that we're doing regime change just like we always did. It turns out, in his view, Obama is no different than George W. Bush or other presidents who had done this. And then the second event happened. Inside Russia, massive demonstrations inside Russia against Putin. And by the way, it's the same year. It's the year of the Arab Spring where autocrats are falling, and suddenly the same thing is happening in Russia. It was sparked by a falsified vote for a parliamentary election. We looked at it and we thought, oh, 6-7%, that's like normal for Russia. There's no big deal here. But these people had a different view. And because they had smartphones and Twitter and Facebook and Bookkontakte, they documented the falsification and then spun it around the internet, and first 50, then 500, 5,000, and eventually 200,000 people came out of the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg and the other big cities, first demanding free and fair votes, right? But you get 200,000 people together, they kind of work themselves up, and by the end of these rallies, they were yelling, Россия без Putina, Russia without Putin. In other words, they were calling for regime change. And remember, the last time you had that many people on the streets? I already told you. It was 20 years earlier. And at the end of these demonstrations in 1991, there was regime change. That's the year the Soviet Union collapsed. So Putin was, well, first of all, Putin's pissed. He's like, I made these people rich. Why are they turning against me? But then he became scared that this might happen to him like it did to the leaders 20 years ago in Russia and was happening throughout the Arab world. And so he needed a new argument to mobilize his supporters and marginalize those people running those opposition demonstrations. And that's where we come in. That's when he decided he needed a new enemy. He needed to explain that those people demonstrating were not patriots, they were not loyalists to Russia, but that they were our agents, that we were doing that. And right as he's making that argument, that's when I arrive as the U.S. ambassador to Russia, okay? Correlation is not causation. We teach that at Stanford. But that's exactly when I arrived. In fact, we got on the getting ready to go. My family, my wife and 2 kids, flying to Russia. We're all ready for this great adventure. It was a really kind of euphoric time, a little bit scary, but we arrive at our big new house. It's called Spaso House. You should take a tour on the web if you get a chance. And for those of you who pay your taxes, thank you. The rent on that place is $800,000 a year. Yes, thank you. And we're kind of touring around. It was a Martin Luther King weekend, I remember, so I had an extra Monday before reporting for work, and we're looking around. It was like we're living in a museum, right? There's photos of Kissinger and Gromyko and Brezhnev and Reagan, and they'd all been to our house that we were living in, and it felt like, man, this is going to be really fun. And that night, I turned on the TV because I wanted to get my Russian going a little bit, right? And that night, there was a 20-minute hit job on me on their #1 news program, explaining to Russians that Obama had sent me to Russia to foment revolution against Putin and his regime. Yeah, that's, and that was my fate. For the next 2 years, I was the poster child of this argument that we are out to get them. America, Obama, and me. And when I say poster child, I actually mean literally poster child. Let's just skip that one. Let's go to the poster. There I am. This is a calendar that they put out in Russian and English, just so you know. All the different months of the year are different opposition leaders, and allegedly they're all subservient to me. Here's a couple other posters just to give you a flavor of what my life was like. The one on the left says, the political circus is coming to town again. May 6, 2012, that was a major demonstration in Russia that actually turned violent. And listed there are all the opposition leaders of that demonstration. And you can see me. I'm listed as the artistic director. Okay? And then here, you've heard about disinformation, fake news, deep fakes. Well, I lived that several years earlier. This is Photoshopped. I hope you can tell that's Photoshopped. That's not me. But what allegedly I'm doing here is I'm campaigning for the leading opposition figure, a guy named Alexei Navalny, who at the time was running for the mayor of Moscow, and allegedly I'm campaigning there. And then you don't have to know Russian, but I just want to give you a flavor of what the television was like. Yeah, give us a little bit of sound. I'll talk over the sound. I'm presuming most people here don't speak Russian. Yes, that's me. What he's explaining is that Obama's removing me because I failed in the revolution. Here he's saying it was a holiday for the opposition leaders when I was named ambassador because I'm an expert in revolutions, and that's what I was coming to do. I didn't have a plane like that, by the way. Here are the opposition figures coming to get their instructions from me. And here, note that I'm also in charge of the fascists, right? Did you notice the swastika? There it is. So you can turn the sound down now. I'll keep talking over the video. So you get a flavor, right? That was my life. Welcome to Moscow, right? And I want, yeah, those are funny. By the way, many of these people in these photos, tragically, either live abroad. Gary Kasparov is shown there. He lives in New York. Chirikova is there. She lives in Estonia. And one of them, Boris Nemtsov, he was assassinated in 2015. All right, now I want to brace you, because you laugh, that's right. This is kind of a funny one. I like to play it. There's Boris Nemtsov. He was the guy that was assassinated, by the way. Now I don't want you to laugh, though, okay? I've warned you. And I'm not going to play the video, but it's kind of jarring, so I've warned you ahead of time. Here's another one. This one is a video that came out 3 weeks after I showed up in Moscow. And, of course, the Kremlin was not involved. It's freedom of the press. You know, we don't control things there, right? It's a dictatorship, but they don't control things. You know, what do you do with that? Like, you get on Twitter and you say, I'm not a pedophile, and then they say, prove it. You know, and that's what disinformation, by the way, our country's suffering through this. This is what disinformation is. It's very difficult to deal with. But you're most certainly, it's going to make it hard to do win-win outcomes with somebody on the other side of the table that's accusing you of being a pedophile, right? And to make sure you don't think it's just about me, here's another video. I'll just show you this one slide. The argument of this hour-long program on their national news program, Kiselov is his name, he says, you know, when you first look at it, you probably don't think that the President of the United States and the leader of ISIS have anything in common. But if you dig a little deeper, it turns out that Barack Hussein Obama and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi actually have exactly the same worldview. And that's what he spent 60 minutes explaining to the Russian people. So that's what ended the reset. That's what ended confrontation. That's what ended cooperation into this confrontational period. Putin was just paranoid about us, and there was nothing we could do to roll him back from that. The last straw, and I hope you now notice a pattern here, it's big demonstrations, people demanding democracy, and Putin blaming us for that happening. This is Ukraine, fall of 2013. Mobilization against the regime. The regime collapses. Yanukovych, the president at the time, flees. He goes to Russia in February 2014. We, the United States of America, we were actually trying to cut a deal between Yanukovych and the opposition to defuse this crisis. 100 people died, by the way, in this fight. And we thought we had a deal on February 21st. It was, you know, we were kind of euphoric about it. I was down at the Sochi Olympics at the time, and we thought we had a deal. 10 hours later, Yanukovych shows up in Russia. To this day, I don't really understand why he left so fast, but Putin had an explanation. It was us, KGB, CIA, Pentagon, the deep state. Here we were, yet again, overthrowing a regime, only this time we just overthrew an ally right on his border. And that's when I think he just said, I am done with these Americans. I'm done dealing with them. I'm done with their clubs. We're going to strike back. And that's when he seized Crimea as payback to that revolution. And when that was pretty easy, that's when he decided to go into eastern Ukraine. And then 2 years later, that's when he decided to go on the offensive against us and do, in his view, what he thinks we've been doing all around the world, meddling and interfering in our elections here in the United States. All right, I've talked a long time. You've been very patient. Let me just finish with the good news, bad news thing and then get to your questions. So if you accept my explanation for this history, there is some good news. The good news is that we are not destined because of history or culture or the balance of power in the international system to be in a confrontation with Russia for you know, the rest of this century. My argument is more about individuals and their perceptions and events and the way they respond, right? So it's my argument's an agency argument versus a structural argument. That's the good news, because that allows for the possibility that with new leadership in Russia, things could change. The bad news is that Putin was just reelected last year. I think he's going to be in power for as long as he's healthy, and the guy works out 3 hours a day. So as long as he's there, I think tragically we are in for a period of confrontation. And I want to emphasize that adjective. It's tragic to me. It is nothing to celebrate. But I think it's just a necessity that we got to go back to some of the things we learned from the Cold War. Contain and deter to make sure that he doesn't wreak havoc in other places. Cooperate when we can, like on arms control. And I would add a big dose of just forgetting about Russia. I think we spend too much time in trying to engage, trying to make them our friends. Now, most people in the Trump administration agree with this pie chart. I have a lot of friends in the Trump administration. Actually, a lot of them lost their jobs recently. H.R. McMaster's now at Stanford. Secretary Mattis is showing up at Stanford May 1st. We're kind of like the refugee camp for Trump national security. I should have used that phrase. I want to withdraw that phrase. I'm withdrawing that phrase formally, okay? We're like a good place for them to come and share their experiences about working in the government. And I'm actually a big fan of Secretary Mattis and H.R. McMaster, by the way. We'll get into that in questions. Most people agree with this in the Trump administration. Most people in my world agree this is the right strategy for Russia. There's just one guy that disagrees. And he just happens to be the President of the United States. This is a poster from Russia, just so you know. That's Le Pen in the middle, Putin on the left. And that tension, and I've never seen anything like it, ever, in the history of writing about this stuff or participating, where the president is at odds with almost his entire administration about a foreign policy. That is the drama, at least for the next couple of years, in terms of how we deal with the Russians. I write about it in detail in the epilogue, and so if you want to go into detail about it, you know what you got to do. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Big Missoula thank you to Ambassador McFaul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you upstairs, too.
So I'm going to start out by saying a lot of you know the drill. There are microphones down here on this side and this side. So if you have a question for Ambassador McFaul, please go ahead and start making your way to those microphones. And if you're up in the balcony, Amy Martin, this might be directed at you. Please come on down for questions. And while you get there, my name is Brian von Lossberg. I serve on council, and I'm getting a lot of mileage out of the space thing, and I'll keep taking advantage of that. But tonight, and as I've been reading Ambassador McFaul's book, I go back. I'm a fellow Stanford alum, and I go back to being a junior about to go to Berlin in 1989 before the wall came down. And I'm back in my 30s running a small organization doing an exchange between Lake Baikal and Russia. Buy his book and read about those times. They were remarkable times, and he describes them eloquently, and I really appreciate his reflections on those. So I'm going to start out while people make their way to the questions with two quick ones. An easy one: what was your freshman dorm?
My freshman dorm at Stanford? Ujima.
Ujima. Okay.
Is there an Ujima fan here? Did you live there too? Oh, hey, I couldn't see you. Yes.
Nice.
We got some Stanford people in the house. Great. Okay.
And the next one, you are a parent. I am a parent. There are students out here. What words of advice or encouragement do you give to prospective students who are considering studying abroad? It's a different world than it was in those years, but I'm curious if you have any advice or words of encouragement to students who are considering that.
Well, you know, I'm always cautious with advice because there are lots of paths, and I don't want to presume the one I took is the right one. But it's kind of obvious from my story, right? I mean, the first time abroad totally changed my life. And I would say that not just about, you know, that I ended up working on Russia. I actually wrote about other parts of the world. I used to work on Africa. But, you know, you just see your own society in a different way when you see it living abroad. And And I saw that in most tellingly recently when I lived abroad with my kids. You know, they lived in Washington, they lived in Palo Alto. Oh, they're fairly sophisticated guys. You know, they've met Barack Obama and, you know, hung out at the White House. So, and yet, living abroad, it's one thing to travel abroad, but to live abroad and to sit in a classroom with mostly people that are not from the United States, and as the relationship's turning in this different way, then you have to think about your assumptions about your country, and you know, there's no other way to do it. You can't do it virtually. You have to do it by getting out there and living abroad. You know, and the other thing I'll say, you know, my story is a tragic one. It ends rather tragically. Because I can't go to Russia right now, right? I've lived in Russia 6, 7, 8 years of my life, all told, since 1983 to 2014. And so it's frustrating to me. I can't go back. Even if I could go back now, I probably wouldn't because I might get arrested. So Putin's really out to get me. But some of my closest friends in life are Russians. And those kinds of relationships are forged when, you know, you're living abroad and doing extraordinary things. So obviously, if you get the chance to go abroad, you should do it. And by the way, I've focused on the big, hard story of U.S.-Russian relations. Being ambassador was fantastic. If you get a job to be ambassador, do it, okay? There were so many incredible things about being ambassador. And if I can just go on for a minute about this, and so you should join the Foreign Service, or you should join the military, or you should join the CIA, or you should join USAID. You know, ambassadors are somewhat different in what we do and the things we get to do. But the greatest part about being the U.S. ambassador was it was my job to celebrate and promote America in Russia. And I think we're a pretty cool, great country, by the way. So I really love doing that. And you know, it was my job to you know, to bring Herbie Hancock. I don't know if you know who he is. Well, some of you do. I'm glad. I was a giant fan of Herbie Hancock as a kid. I was a trumpet player. And all of a sudden, Herbie Hancock is in my house performing for 500 of my closest friends. I had a room that was big enough to hold 500 people. And that was my job. It was awesome. I had the NBA came to my house. They haven't been to my house in Palo Alto. And I'm gonna garble the name. Gosh, I should have looked it up because it's in the book. Wiley and they're a Montana band.
Wiley and the Wild West.
Right, Wiley Gustafson and the Cowboy something or other, right? They're from Conrad? I forgot. Can I tell the story because it's a Montana story?
You can.
All right, okay. He's in charge. So this is a classic clash of Montana meets the State Department, okay? Totally, they were scheduled to come to Moscow well before I was the ambassador, right? These things are scheduled well ahead of time. But they were one of the first entertainment groups that we had hosted at Spaso House. And I got all excited. My dad's was a country western musician, right? And so I was like, wow, this is going to be really fun. I went to talk to the protocol officer at Spaso House about this event. And I went down to the ballroom, and there was no dance floor. And I'm looking at this, and I'm like, you know, I won't name her name. Let's just call her Maria. Maria, where's the dance floor? And she looked at me rather sternly, and she said, Mr. Ambassador, we don't dance at Spaso House. You know, this is a serious place. People are going to have their ties on, and they're going to be, you know, very important figures from the establishment. That just, you know, we don't do that. And remember, I'm the outside guy. I'm not only the guy from Montana. I'm also the political appointee, right? So I'm not from the State Department culture. And I was like, well, you can't do that. You know, there was nothing more deflating to my dad than to spend 4 hours performing at night and have everybody sit on their hands, right? Like that's the worst, that was the worst night. And so I said, we had to negotiate. And so finally we took out 3 rows of chairs as a compromise. And she's like, but you know, nobody here will ever dance, Mr. Ambassador. You don't understand Russian culture. And so they started playing, and they're great, and they're fun, and I'm waiting to see if anybody will dance, and nobody dances. And so finally I stood up with my wife, and I can do the two-step, not that well, but we started, and immediately 200 people just exploded into this space and kicked out all these chairs, and there was a lot of bad dancing going on, by the way. Russians don't know how to do the two-step. But it was just magical, and you know, so Putin and Obama are clashing, but moments like that where we're bonding through music, they were great experiences. So if you get the chance,
I wasn't supposed to announce it, but Ambassador McFaul will be at the Union Club later this evening. I can tell that there are people at this mic. The floor is yours, and I'm going to ask people to be brief, and believe me, the irony of me saying that is not lost on me.
And I'll be brief too. I've been going on too long. So,
first of all, I would like to make a plug for the Peace Corps. If you
excellent.
want to go overseas
Peace Corps is awesome.
and really get to know people, Peace Corps is it. So anyway,
fantastic.
now my question. It seems to me that the reason that the Russians were so involved in Syria was to maintain their Mediterranean port, because even since Peter the Great, they've been wanting to have a nice open water port.
Yeah.
So do you agree with that?
I think that was part of the explanation. Yes, I do. But I don't think it's the full explanation. Because that port's kind of a, you know, it's kind of a B-class, C-class port. It's important, but it wasn't the main motivation. The main motivation was to prevent regime change. It was to not let their ally, Assad, fall in the way that those other places had fallen. And remember, back in 2003, Iraq, Saddam Hussein had a fairly close relationship with Russia. And when the Bush administration decided to invade Iraq, which I think was a mistake, by the way, I think that was I did not think that that was the right strategy. But for Putin, that was a big blow to his reputation in the region, because it turned out he couldn't protect his ally. And so fast forward to 2011, 2012, he said to us, that meeting in Los Cabos was mostly about Syria, and he said to us, I think your theory of change is wrong. This is not going to lead to democracy. This will lead to chaos, and that's why we have to support this strong leader, Assad. And our theory was right. Our argument, President Obama's argument was, if we let this thing fester, it's going to become more violent, and extremists are going to show up, and that's exactly what happened. But one other thing happened. Putin invaded. And so he wasn't just an analyst, he was an actor in a way that we chose not to be.
Thank you very much.
Setting the bar for a clear, concise question. This side of the room.
Yes, and I plan to buy your book as soon as I go out.
Sure, thanks.
On the subject of fascism, do you feel, given Putin's playbook and his behavior and tactics, do you feel he's, even though he'll use fascist, and that's historic as I understand it in Russia, if they want to vilify, especially European competitors and enemies, do you feel he's a crypto-fascist? Second follow-up question, do you feel, what are your thoughts on the future of the Baltic states, especially Estonia?
Baltics, you said.
The Baltic states.
Baltics,
Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania.
Yeah.
EU and NATO members. And then thirdly, do you feel we're...
Thirdly!
Oh, no,
No, it's all related. It's all about fascism.
Okay.
No, I'm not going to go there. Those are the two questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is somebody going to ask me about Barack Obama's jump shot? Those are hard, big questions. Is Putin a fascist? I would not use the word fascist to describe him, although he is a nationalist. He does espouse ideas along ethnic lines, and where the lines are, different people have different places. I would not use that term to describe him, however. I do think he encourages and empowers people with those leanings. When my friend was assassinated in 2015, I don't know for a fact that Putin ordered the assassins to kill him. We don't know that for sure. But did he create the permissive conditions for that? My answer to that is yes, because he called this guy an enemy of the state. right? Think about that phrase. We've been hearing that phrase a lot, enemy of the people. Vrag naroda is how you say it in Russian. When President Trump is using that, that's a phrase that Stalin was first using. And when you call somebody that, that kind of creates an open, license for those of more extremist natures to do things. So I think that's the way he plays there. With respect to the Baltics, the good news is that the Baltic states are in NATO, and that, I think, reduces the probability of them being invaded by Putin. I'm a big believer in that. I think it's highly unlikely that Russian tanks will roll into Tallinn because of NATO. If NATO wasn't there, it would be a totally different story. The bad news is something less than that that actually scares me a lot. Here's the scenario that scares me a lot. There's a town on the Estonian-Russian border called Narva. It's part of Estonia. Anybody from Narva here? Good, then I can keep going. Okay, I got to be careful. Actually, at my institute that I run at Stanford, the former president of Estonia is one of my fellows, so I always got to be a little more nervous around Tomas Ilves. But here's my nightmare scenario. That's an ethnically predominant, it's almost all Russian there in Narva, right? Let's say some Estonian young men, I don't know around here, but around the world, young men get drunk sometimes, and then sometimes they get violent. I don't know what happens here, but I know it happens in other places. In fact, I know for a fact it happens in Estonia. That's right. Because in 1985, I was in Estonia, in Tallinn, and a bunch of drunk Finnish people came into the bar that we were in, and one of them slugged me because he thought I was Russian. So you don't have to have imagination to, a bunch of drunk kids, and let's say somebody gets killed. Ethnic Russian gets killed. And on the other side of the border, the Special Forces guys, they're all there. They say, we're going to go teach them a lesson. We're going to go in, and they kill 6 or 7 Estonians, and then they go home. What are we going to do? Are we going to go to war with Russia over that? My guess is not many people here in Missoula want to go to war with Russia over that. And I know there's a lot of people in Italy and Hungary and Germany and France that would never go to war with Russia over that. And that's the scenario that is a slippery slope, because if we're not credible, Article 5, it's called, in the NATO Charter, if we are not credible to that, then he chips away at that. So those are the scenarios I worry most about.
Thanks. Over here.
I'm not being fast. I got to pretend I'm on Twitter.
You're doing great.
All right, okay, all right.
Hi, you said elections, presidential elections, are one of the most sovereign things we do. In 1996, the United States rigged the Russian presidential election for Boris Yeltsin. His economic policies killed, according to an Oxford University study, 10 million Russians between 1991 and 1999. He also appointed Putin as his successor, and I was wondering what you think the United States' role is in really starting this all off in the first place.
So, have you read my book?
No.
I can tell you haven't read my book. Okay. I'll buy it for you. How about that? So there's a couple...
Will you pay me to read it, or...?
All right, that was good. That was good.
Missoula.
All right, so there's a couple of things that are just inaccurate in what you said, and then there's a really important seed that I think we need to chew on. So the United States did not rig the elections in 1996 for Boris Yeltsin. That's just not true. It's not true. And I've written about it. I'll send you articles from that period. We did not do that. Whether that election was free and fair, that's a different matter, and I think that's a bigger argument. What happened in that election in terms of what America did, we did do two things. One, we did signal to Yeltsin that we were going to support him financially and in terms of an IMF package. That's true. And the other thing that happened was a group of Americans, political advisors, were hired by somebody close to Yeltsin to come work on his campaign from January to March. And that's what's created the very famous, there was a Time magazine thing, Yanks to the rescue to win, and that's what created this story that we intervened there. A couple of facts. Those guys were fired in April 3 months before. They just were chilling in Moscow. I met them. I know who they are. And number two, they were hired guns. And I think it's an important question you raised, by the way. We have people all over. Actually, one of your alums. I don't know if you know this guy, Mike Messina. Jim Messina. Mike Messina is a baseball player.
At Stanford.
He's a baseball player. Sorry. Actually, Jim Messina would be happy that I compared him to Mike Messina. But Messina, David Axelrod, these are people I used to work with. They go and work abroad. Should that be legal or not? I don't know. But that's different than saying that because Messina shows up, that the United States of America rigged the election. Your other points, though, are harder. In that, in the 90s, we did support market reforms. And those were hard for Russians. I was living in Russia for most of that time. They survived an economic depression that was 3 times worse than the depression that we had in the 1930s. Now, there's an argument, is that just the necessary transitional cost of going from a communist system to a market system? And I think there's a lot of data to suggest that it is, because all countries, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, all of them went through that. But in my view, and this is what I write about in the book, that's why I asked, I think we should have done a lot more in providing social welfare to Russians in the 1990s, and that we did not engage back then. I think we suffered the consequences from that. And I think the backlash that Putin has managed to propagate, in part, he can tell that story because we, at the moment of that photo with 300,000 people, and we're all together and we're all going to be Democrats together, we then said, oh, do svidaniya, it's great. The Cold War's over. You're on your own. We don't really care. Remember, there was an election right after that in 1992. There was this regional governor running at the time. And he had a slogan, you're too young to remember, but he said, it's the economy, stupid. We need to invest in America. Does that sound familiar? We need to invest in America now that this Cold War is over, because we got problems here at home. We're not going to be sending a lot of money to Russia. His name was Bill Clinton. And that the confluence of those events, I think we missed a really important moment in the history of U.S.-Russia relations.
We're going to do 1 or 2 more. We're going to end at 9. I believe you'll be back in the back signing books. Over here next.
I was wondering if you could talk about Benghazi and if there was any backstory in the crazy movie that came out and the assassination of the ambassador.
No, I don't think there is any crazy story. I think the story that Secretary Clinton told and my friends at the White House, that is the truth. Maybe, did we exaggerate when that film came out? Somewhat, maybe in the margins. I would say as somebody who worked at the White House during times of crises, that's pretty standard. But the giant conspiracy thing, I think, is it's just not true. And I think we wasted a lot of time and your money trying to find that there was, and there wasn't one indictment. Nothing came out of it. And then I think that's the evidence. I knew Ambassador Stevens, and he was a great man. He was a great ambassador, and it was a really tragic thing. And it bothers me as an American that instead of celebrating him, we went on this partisan witch hunt for people that were trying to do the right thing at the time. And by the way, that had, I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Over on this side.
Do you think there's any validity to Eastern Ukrainians who feel that they are ethnic Russians? They speak Russian with their family, they speak Russian with their friends, they live in Crimea or they live in Donetsk. Do you think there's any validity to them saying maybe we should be Russia, maybe we should be part of Russia?
Yeah, that's a hard question. And the way I would answer it, which is not going to be satisfying probably to you, is if there's a constitutional way for them to secede from the Union, notice I'm invoking 1861 on purpose, then I support it. But if there's not a constitutional way to do it, then how do you adjudicate those things, right? And I would say that's a very slippery slope, because there are very few countries in the world that are ethnically homogenous. And once you start saying, well, you know, the Poles here, the Hungarians there, the Romanians there, by the way, there are a lot of people that look and talk like me just up there in Canada, you know, where do you stop? And so I think the idea, better, you know, good or bad, you know, there's a different matter where the borders came from, right? But we kind of agreed as an international community after this horrific thing called World War II, when, you know, Hitler made an argument that, well, they're ethnic Germans, what's the big deal? You know, they want to join us. You know, why shouldn't they have the chance to do that? And it was out of that horrible tragedy where we decided that annexation as a principle in international affairs needed to be banned. Now, you know, we're in a slippery slope right now, both with Ukraine and in Israel. I think if we begin to say, well, it's okay in some instances for annexation, you're going to hear a lot more claimants around the world that want to rewrite the borders that they think were unjustly written, you know, whether it's in Africa or China and Taiwan, and I think it's a slippery slope. But I don't want to dismiss how difficult the issue is. I think it's a really hard issue for all multi-ethnic societies, including Ukraine.
So this is going to be our last one on the left.
Okay, better be good. No, I'm just
Super
kidding.
easy. Are you a Giants fan? No, that's
Giants?
not my question.
Yeah, I'm a Giants fan. Yeah, I'm a Giants
not
fan.
my question. How do the younger people feel in Russia about us, about Putin, I mean, about Trump? Even though they did elect Putin, it doesn't mean that, you know, elected officials get into power that aren't idiots. As we all know.
Do you have a political opinion you'd like to express?
Anyway, I'm always kind of curious of how the young people, because those are usually the change. I mean, I feel like the millennials are the future of us, which might be a little scary, but how do they feel?
Great one to end
on. All right, that's a great place to end. And I'm going to take a little time to answer that, because it's a really hard, big question, okay? Well, actually, I'll take as much time as you allow me. So first, a couple of data points about Putin and popularity in winning elections. When I used to work for the president, you know, I would write his briefing book about Russia when we were going off to a meeting with Medvedev for Putin. And there are always two numbers that he really focused on in his briefing book. One, what was Putin's popularity? And it was always higher than his. And two, how rich was he? And it was always higher than Obama's. Those two numbers. But that would get under Obama's skin, right? Because Obama's a really competitive guy. I did play basketball with him. That's why I wanted a question about his jump shot. And he would look at that, and he would want to add some context to what you just said, that you prompted me to say. First, he would say, and I don't want to put words in